This is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America. On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, we talk to prominent US citizens, not just about their country's past and present, but also about its future. What, I ask my American guests, will be the 21st century fate of their now venerable republic? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Keen on America, in which I talk to prominent Americans about their country. And today we have a wonderful guest. Many of you will be familiar with Bobi Conn. She's the author of two huge hits, In the Shadow of the Valley and A Woman in Time. And she has a new book coming out tomorrow, Someplace Like Home. She's a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer. Her work is deeply autobiographical. And I'm going to, Bobi, I thought we would begin by you telling me a little bit about yourself, where you were born. You don't have to give your age away exactly, but it'd be good to get some sort of generational idea.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me. I grew up in Eastern Kentucky. It's called Round County. We refer to our counties in Kentucky a lot. So it was a little town, a little university town, but I grew up out in a holler. So also known as a hollow, but we refer to it as a holler. Really just growing up with a lot of the socioeconomic and personal problems that have become associated with Appalachia, systemic poverty, a lot of the opioid addiction that really ravaged the region. For us, I believe I was seeing it in the 80s. That's when I was a child. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of my timeline. And then it's became certainly documented in the 1990s. So that's where I grew up. And I was really a product of my time and place, I think, in a lot of ways, but very much in love with and inspired by the region as well. It is just such a beautiful place. The landscape itself is incredibly beautiful. And then, of course, we had a really rich sense of home. And despite the problems in our family, family was hugely important and a necessary part of me being able to find my way out of the same problems that we were mired in.
You mentioned that you were from a holler. I have to admit, I didn't know much about it. I did a little bit of research. A Kentucky hollow, HOLLOWS. What exactly is that?
So the dictionary definition is basically that it's a valley. And so the topography of Eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian region is such that you have the Appalachian Mountains, and then you have the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And you have a lot of areas where there's a little bit of flat land and usually a stream running at the bottom of those hills and mountains. And that's where a lot of the people, built their homes. It's really hard to build on top of the mountains. They're very rugged and, really difficult to traverse. So the hollers were your best place for building a home and doing a little bit of subsistence farming as well, because you get a little bit of sunshine, not as much as you do out in the open land. But it's really become also a symbol of the culture too, I believe the holler has. There's really a sense of, the place giving rise to a certain identity within the people And I think that that's in part because of the difficulty that life in a holler gives rise to.
In a sense, Bobi, were you living outside the state in a holler? Was it something that existed away from government? Did you think of yourself in a sense? I know you've got an essay coming out on outlaw storytelling, but did your family and your community, did you think of yourself in a sense as outlaws?
I definitely thought of my father that way. There was a story that I was familiar with as a kid where the state police came up to our house one time and parked in the road in front of the house, which may have been like 50 feet away or so. My father kept a loaded shotgun by the front door. And when the police stopped and probably honked or yelled for him to come outside, he came out with his gun in hand. And, they left. He was involved in quite a bit of criminal activity. And I don't know what this particular house call was for, but it was the one and only time that I know of the police ever coming up there. And he was very proud of the fact that they left without, following up or following through on the reason for being there. It was really it's this interesting, like two sides of the same coin. One of the things that he used to do was turn our electric meter upside down so it would run backwards so that we would be able to pay the bill. So we had that kind of leeway. Now, eventually he got caught and they put a lock on and he broke the lock and then they put another one on. But at the same time, our electric service was so unreliable. We didn't have to get a really strong storm to lose power. And the stove that we had was a coal stove, but it had to be powered in part by electric. I don't know what the mechanics of it were.
You mentioned, Bobi, that he broke the law a lot.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds to me like a relatively mild way of breaking the law. Were there more serious examples?
Yeah. So he was definitely involved in pretty much every kind of black market dealings that a person could have, selling drugs, buying drugs. He was really abusive, physically abusive to my mother, especially. And there was no legal repercussion for that. He threatened people at gunpoint, shot at people more than once that I'm aware of. So just a wide range of violence and illegal activity. He stole copper from railroad lines as well and managed to not go to prison for that. So, and he also paralyzed a woman because he got really high while he was driving an oxygen truck. He got really high on a stolen tank of nitrous oxide and wrecked into someone and paralyzed her. But again, didn't end up doing jail time for that.
Bobi, goes without saying, certainly for people watching this, that you're white. How diverse was this community? And could a black man have got away with going out with a gun to the police and driving them off?
I really grew up in a very non-diverse community. At the time, I believe there was one black family that I went to school with the children, at least. So there was not a sense of overt racism that I witnessed among my peers or community members, but there were also not a lot of opportunities to see that kind of thing on display. Now, it being a university town, life in the city limits may have been a bit different. And I suspect, probably a person of color wouldn't have gotten away with doing the things that my father did. And I really don't know why he got away with them as much as he did. If it was just something about the time and place. I feel like it wouldn't be like that today, but there's probably also places that police avoid still. So I think that's a really interesting question to dive into.
Bobby, in Keen on America, I ask all my guests how they think of themselves as Americans. Did your father or your family, did they think of themselves as Americans, as in the outlaw tradition? I mean, in a way, the story you tell is like a movie, a 19th century movie of cowboys living outside the law.
Yeah, I think that our family, and certainly my sort of unconscious understanding as a child, was that we were fiercely patriotic. We all loved America and had a lot of pride in the country that we're in. And at the same time, Eastern Kentucky is a very disenfranchised area. My father was a very disempowered person himself. And I think that gave, it really fueled the fire of his anger and destruction. So, I think there was a deep love for America. And at the same time, there was a sense that we're not part of it in the way that everyone else is part of it, nor being served in some of the same ways.
You grew up in the 80s at the intersection, I guess, of the end of the Cold War and the beginning of American wars in the Middle East, which were often fought, I think, by people from your class rather than the upper classes of the coastal elites. What was the attitude to America and military war and its empire, its place in the world? Did your father and his friends, your mother, your family, did you talk about it?
Probably just a little bit. I think that national politics really seemed very far away from our daily struggles. And that wasn't, so certainly like Iraq, those engagements, that was not something that my family talked about actively. A lot of my grandparents and their siblings were in the military, sometimes in active war, sometimes just National Guard. But they didn't talk a lot about their experiences, and there were deaths in some of those wars as well that they would have been part of. So yeah, it wasn't something that we discussed overtly, and there wasn't, I think at the same time, it was just the sense that, America was doing the right thing, even if sometimes misguided, that it was for the right reasons, like the right motivations. So, but again, we were struggling to eat. We were struggling to keep the electric on. We didn't have clean water to drink. So things like the philosophical ramifications of a war that's not on our soil really just didn't factor into daily conversation very much.
What about domestic politics? Did your family vote? Were they nostalgic for another political age? Were they nostalgic for the New Deal, for FDR? What was their view on Reagan and the new Republican Party and the shift in American politics that began, I guess, in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, went through to the 80s, where increasingly the Republican Party became the party of the white working class?
So my grandparents were still Democrats when I was little. I think they remained Democrats until they died. I think that they still held on to the idea that the Democratic Party was more of the party for the people, for them. And interestingly, in Kentucky, even though Kentucky has gone for the Republican presidential nominees, I believe for at least the last 3 or so elections. We have a Democratic governor currently, and it's really interesting because you would think that there's some sort of strict alignment with the Republican Party if the state is voting in that way. But I believe we have a lot of Democratic politicians in Kentucky, local and state politicians, who've been more willing to engage with people. And that has led to, people responding to the politician that is talking about their current issues and the local problems. Whereas the national stage, it is in some ways just so very far away still.
Bobi, it's interesting. You've got an essay coming out, might already appear by the time this interview goes out in time, on the demonization of rural America. But for people listening, they might be thinking, oh my God, this is not a place that I would want to go to, an abusive father who breaks the law, a violent father. Tell me a little bit more about this piece that you've written for Time and why you're so concerned about the demonization of rural America, even if you yourself in your own way, you're certainly not demonizing rural America, but you're telling the truth about it, and it's not always the prettiest truth.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most important things for me is to look at how some of these issues are universal, right? Like there's abuse going on in urban America. There's certainly abject poverty in urban America. And there's drug addiction and abuse and all of the other ills in suburban America as well. When I first began writing my memoir, quite a few years ago now, even though it was published in 2020, one of the first questions I asked myself was, what's wrong with us? What's wrong with my people? Because I was writing these stories about my individual life. And I thought...
Because, of course, In the Shadow of the Valley, which came out in 2020.
Yes, thank you. So I was associating these stories, these sometimes terrible, sometimes entertaining stories about my life with just the people that I grew up with. And it took a little time for me to work through and think about what was specific and unique to the place and the culture where I grew up versus what's happening everywhere. And then so my next question is, why did I always think that our history and our story looked so ugly in comparison? And I think still there are a lot of people who are quick to look at the social ills in rural America and conflate it with moral decay, whereas that's not the same thing that always happens when there's a discussion about problems in urban and suburban America. Like opioid addiction, I think, is a really good example of that. The commentary I've experienced about opiates in Eastern Kentucky, it has a sense of there being a moral problem, whereas when it became an issue in urban and suburban America, there's a lot more discussion of harm reduction and trying to treat it as a public health issue rather than just criminal activity. So that's just one kind of really broad dichotomy between the urban and rural discussion. But I feel like it's a big issue. And I think it's one of the problems that keeps us from moving forward collectively as a nation. We don't understand, and sometimes we're making assumptions about what different populations have to live with, what it takes to survive, and then why they make the choices they make.
We're speaking with Bobi Conn, one of America's most distinguished writers from Kentucky, the author of a new book this week, Someplace Like Home. I want to remind everyone that great guests like Bobi Conn are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, excellent new quarterly journal of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on liberties, and then we'll be back with Bobi. We'll talk more about her story, her relationship with her mother, and her new novel, Someplace Like Home. So we'll be back in a second. Don't go away, anyone.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Bobi Conn, author of Someplace Like Home. It's her third book. Many of you will be familiar with her first book, an autobiography, In the Shadow of the Valley, a memoir. It's got almost 9,000 positive reviews on Amazon, a huge hit. And she's also the author of A Woman in Time, a novel. This second book is a follow-up. Bobi, you talked about your father. Tell me about your mother, because this is a book, this latest novel, Someplace Like Home. It's a mother-daughter narrative. What was your mother like? Or what is your mother like?
Yeah. So I grew up really not perceiving her as kind of her own sovereign being, which when my memoir came out, she and I had a conversation. I wanted to forewarn her because I really thought she was going to be pretty unhappy about me airing our dirty laundry, as it were. And I knew that I was putting a lot of her painful memories out into the world as well, because I describe a lot of the abuse she experienced because I was witnessing it. So I was describing from my perspective, but I knew that it had the potential to hurt her or to dredge up old feelings that would be difficult. And the conversations that we had thereafter made me realize really quickly that she was living her own story while I was living mine. And like many women from domestic abuse, and situations, she never has found a way to tell her story or to own her voice. And that was something that she longed for. And she shared that with me. And I really, wanted to do that for her and help her have that experience in some way, because I also feel like it's a really important thing to do for that group of our society as well. Help bridge the gap between the people who are experiencing abuse and then the people who observe from the outside and may not understand what's going on.
Bobi, you're talking to me now from Berea in Kentucky. Lovely looking place. I have to admit, I haven't been. I'd love to visit. You, and I use this word carefully, maybe you'll correct me. You escaped your rural poverty. You were the first person in your family to go to college in Berea. How did you do it as a female? Did you have to fight your father? Did your father, or does your father, have pride in what you've accomplished?
I don't know. I had to cut ties 2 different times. I briefly connected with him again to purchase my grandparents' home from him that he inherited. And that's a whole other story that I've written about. But yeah, I am sure that he wouldn't be happy about some of the things that I shared in my memoir about the things that he did. I feel like he has a pretty deep-seated denial. He always expressed, some pride in me being intelligent, but he's someone that I don't think can help but be abusive at this point, or manipulative at the very least. So I've cut ties with him, and I don't know what he thinks about what I'm doing or how much he's aware of it.
The book is, as I said, a book about it's a novel about a relationship between the Mackenzie women. It's of a different time during the Prohibition era. But is it in any sense autobiographical in terms of you and your mother?
So that was my last novel, A Woman in Time.
Apologies, Someplace Like Home. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Yes.
So it's the mother and daughter in. So you're unpacking the traumas of the past.
Yeah, I asked my mom to tell me about her most formative and significant experiences to establish the framework of Someplace Like Home, and then drawing from stories from her and my own memories, and also from family members' memories. I created some fictional characters to represent my mother, her family, myself, and then really just try to sink into this character as an imagined version of my mother and figure out what would have gotten her from her childhood, as she described it, through her teenage years, as she described them, and then into the adult years that are very fraught with violence and a lot of pain. And then, she has definitely blocked out a lot of her memories as well for those years that she was with my father. So I had to create this fictional world and these fictional people. But for me, it's very much an exercise of trying to put myself in my mother's shoes so that I could understand, why did she allow our father to abuse me and my brother ultimately?
And what conclusion did you come up with?
My conclusion is that really, there's so much that goes into a person's personality and the choices that they feel they can make and that they have a right to make. That's where her rural setting and the constraints of that world were really interesting for me to explore. But my mom also experienced a really traumatic motorcycle wreck at the age of 18. And she married my father about 6 months after that happened. She would have been suffering from a traumatic brain injury that went undiagnosed and untreated. So, she quickly went from an unhealthy dating relationship into this physical, serious problem that would have compromised her judgment. And then from there, it was just, I think, an onslaught of abuse and tearing down her sense of self in physical ways, emotional and psychological manipulation. And therefore, her ability to see clearly just became less and less strong. And that's what happens in abusive relationships. So I gained a lot of compassion for her. I thought that I would, but I really didn't understand what it meant when I first set out to write it. And at some point it clicked in me just how unmoored she must have felt at times within her marriage. And so I think that she was really just trying to survive. I don't think that it occurred to her that me or my brother were also suffering there, not because she didn't love us, but because her ability to see clearly and to comprehend fully was just obliterated by that point.
Doesn't sound like a fun household, a fun childhood. Did you have any fun growing up?
Yeah, and I hate that it may sound so negative. All of the books that I've written, including this one, I do really try to also bring in just the intense beauty that we were growing up around.
You've got this great photo on your X page of beautiful woods. It makes me feel like I want to go to those. Are those in Kentucky? That photo?
Yep, that's it here in Berea. So if you ever visit, I could take you right to that spot.
No, well,
Yeah.
I'd love to go. Yeah. So it was the land that made your childhood more cheerful. Is that fair?
Yes, yes, definitely. And then there were people too. My granny and papa that I grew up next to were really important, positive figures. I had teachers who changed my life by giving me some of the love and positivity that I wasn't getting at home. And I read voraciously. So I was convinced as a child that there was a lot of beauty in the world, even if it wasn't inside my house in any given moment.
And you eventually, and I use this word carefully, you escaped, or you certainly had a very different life from your mother. You got a bachelor's degree at Berea College, which is the first school in the American South to integrate racially. How did that experience change your sense of what it meant to be an American?
So I think that when first it is very appropriate to use the word escaped. I think that that's spot on. But as far as getting that degree, when I came to Berea, I ended up studying philosophy, not meaning to, but it quickly appealed to me. And it really just honed my critical thinking skills so much. And it helped me see my place in the world. It helped me to see that I wasn't just, some girl from this like outlaw family of hillbillies who were struggling to survive and nobody was thriving. It showed me that there was this larger context that I come from and that even my father comes from. And there's this wide array of factors that we can look at. Like his generation, some of the research that I did for my memoir showed that his generation was the most violent generation, and it was the worst generation for domestic abuse, for instance. And there are a lot of different theories as to why that might be. But yeah, it helped me to see myself as having a place in the world and also having a right to have a voice, to ask questions, and to share my thoughts with others as to what's valuable, what's important, and where meaning comes from.
Was the role of alcohol important, do you think, in why that the generation of your father was so historically abusive?
I don't think that alcohol was the most important factor for my father. I told the story earlier of how he paralyzed a woman because he was on nitrous oxide. He drank when I was younger, but it was the pills that I learned early on to associate with danger. I saw people drinking, casually, quite a bit, sometimes getting drunk, but there weren't a lot of drunken fights. There were a lot of, I think, pill fueled or withdrawal fueled fights and attacks.
So in a sense, what we think of now as the opioid epidemic, which seems fairly contemporary, began much earlier.
Yeah, I think it was the CDC where I read that there's been 3 waves throughout American history, recent history at least, when it comes to pharmaceutical opioids, and that the first one was in the 90s, which really, matched up with my experience, though I'm pretty confident my father was using them in the mid 80s. So it probably just hadn't become widespread enough yet to really hit that radar until the 90s.
You yourself are a single mother. It doesn't sound to me as if history has repeated itself, but how do you think of yourself in the broader narrative of your parents and your place in the community? You noted earlier that in a sense you escaped, that in a sense you've built a career on remembering it and giving meaning to it.
Well, I do want to acknowledge that I was very self-destructive in my teen years and in my early adulthood years. Becoming a mother really gave me that opportunity to make a conscious choice about what I wanted my life to look like. And I'm not sure what would have happened if I hadn't become a mother. So I do see that as a really important turning point in my life. I was always seeking and desiring goodness and stability, but I really had to create my own foundation and search and struggle to find the right tools to get me out of poverty and to get me out of cycles of violence. And now, I think now I see my story as something that can help other people. And therefore, I think there's a lot of beauty in it. And I wouldn't go back and change it at this point, because I can give my kids the love that they need and also the stability that they deserve. I think they're going to thrive much more easily than I could have. And I know now that when I'm telling my stories and putting them out there for the rest of the world, there are people who still haven't quite gotten there. And that can give them hope to see my story. And then there are others who just don't understand the people that they're looking at who are struggling and self-sabotaging. And I'm hoping my stories can help them understand that group of people as well.
Your books are about the past, of course, your own story, the Prohibition era. Even the latest book has an element of history in it. But in a sense, then, are you writing for the future? You're writing for future generations, perhaps writing for your children?
Oh, absolutely. That is something that I really tried to drive home in the last section of Someplace Like Home, is that, I think it's important and really wonderful to think about history and to understand it. But then, we don't need to wallow in it. We don't need to, spend too much time worrying about who did what wrong in the past. I think the important thing is to empower ourselves to build a better present, knowing that we're setting everyone up for a brighter future.
And speaking of that, let's end on a brighter future. One of our previous guests on the show was the UC Berkeley sociologist, friend of mine, Arlie Russell Hochschild. Many of you will be familiar with her book, Strangers in Their Own Land. She has a new book coming out called Stolen Pride, Lost Shame and the Rise of the Right, in which she writes also about Kentucky. And she talks about how to bring America back together. What's your sense on all this, Bobi? You talked about the dangers of demonizing America. How can your story, your community help bring America together again rather than tearing it apart?
I think that, one of the main themes that comes out of Someplace Like Home is not just understanding why women in a specific type of relationship might make the decisions that they make, but also understanding why people living in these rural places might see the world the way they do, right? I don't know what it takes to survive in inner city LA or to live in New York City, and I find it pretty daunting. And at the same time, there's a lot of people who couldn't just move up to the holler where I was born and figure out how to make a life for themselves that's fulfilling and joyful and meaningful. So I think that if we can just try to understand through stories and conversations, what are people contending with? What kind of strengths do you actually face day to day? Then one, we can stop arguing and just sort of placing blame all the time. Then also start taking the right steps toward policy changes and other socioeconomic and cultural, political steps that we can take to really solve those issues and move forward together.
Finally, Bobi, I can't resist asking you this. We haven't mentioned Donald Trump, who I'm guessing is relatively popular still in Kentucky. Certainly writers like J.D. Vance from the right have made names for themselves out of similar families and family histories like yours. What do you make of the current politics in America? What do you make of the fact that the Trumps and the J.D. Vances of the world seem to, for better or worse, have appropriated your kind of story, your community, your culture to build their own political strengths?
I think that we have a long worldwide history that we can look at and see what happens when large groups of people are economically disempowered and just, politically disenfranchised. And that those are the perfect times to manipulate a large group of people through their emotions, right? By instigating anger, placing blame, sort of averting their gaze from the reality to other issues that they can be used as a tool to accomplish like political goals. So I think it's really unfortunate, but also really predictable, and that we should be smart enough by now to, if we see groups of people being manipulated in that way, that we should be figuring out, why are they able to be manipulated? What are the factors there? And then what can we do to fix that? What kind of conversations do we need to have to counter the manipulative arguments that they're being exposed to? And that's the part that I don't feel like we've gotten to yet. I feel like there's a lot of hand-wringing and frustration over people like me and my culture, my subculture, the choices they've made, the political choices they've made, but not really a lot of talk about what do we do to fix it and to counter it. And to me, it doesn't seem like it's so complicated. It does seem complex and difficult, but not complicated to figure out what the problem is there.